everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson. It is December, everybody, and the only thing I like more than Halloween is Christmas, so it's a fun time for me. We got the lights on the house, we got the tree up. Hope everybody is having a nice holiday season. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving. We have a really good show for you this week. Sofia Ajram is going to be here to talk about one of the best horror debuts of the year, Coup de Grace, and to talk about one of the most fun horror films of the past 25 years, the House on Haunted Hill remake from 1999. It's a great chat, and we'll get to it shortly. But first, I wanted to give you a couple of recommendations. The first thing I'm going to recommend on the movie side is Black Christmas. It's not a new recommendation. You've heard me talk about it on the show before, but Black Christmas from 1974 is my favorite Christmas horror movie. It is one of my top 10 horror films of all time. It is kind of the blueprint for every slasher that came after it, at least for the first 10 years or so until Nightmare on Elm Street came along and blew that whole spot up. Margot Kidder is amazing in it. Olivia Hussey's amazing in it. And very importantly, it is going to be the topic of our December 18th show, which is the last show we have before Christmas. And I can go ahead and tell you that our very first guest on this show, Clay McLeod Chapman, will be back to talk about Black Christmas with me to celebrate the 50th anniversary of that film and to just have a nice time talking about Christmas horror movies. Again, that will drop December 18th. So watch Black Christmas while you can. You're going to love it. It's fantastic. It's a masterpiece. And then come back and join us on December 18th for the show. On the book side of things, I'm reading a ton of stuff right now. There's a lot of stories swirling around in my head because I'm trying to get my best of the year list together over at Paste Magazine. You'll be able to read that soon. But one of the horror novels that I'm reading and really, really, really enjoying is This Wretched Valley by Jenny Kiefer. I said reading, but I should say read. I've already read it. It is a really great sort of wilderness horror story about a group of people who go out to discover/map a new rock climbing face that they found kind of out in the Kentucky wilderness. And it starts with some of the darkest stuff you've ever read, and then it rewinds to sort of explain to you how we got to that darkness. And the way Jenny slowly unfolds it and laces in all of these little details and then kind of keeps unleashing them on characters. You think you know what's going to happen because you think you can see the trap she's setting for this narrative, but the way they actually work into the story, the way it all works, is completely unexpected and wonderfully well done. And it's one of those books that it's exactly what it says on the tin. You're going to get some great wilderness survival horror kind of stuff, but it's very much its own sort of beautifully flowing natural thing. And Jenny is such a confident storyteller. One of my favorites of the year. You should definitely check out This Wretched Valley. And that's it for recommendations this week. Let's head over to our interview with the wonderful Sofia Ajram. Joining us this week on The Scares That Shaped Us is one of my favorite rising stars in horror right now. She's the editor of Bury Your Gaze, an anthology of tragic queer horror. She is a metalsmith. She is a photographer. He is the author of an amazing debut novella called Coup de Grace. Sofia Ajram, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
My pleasure. I'm excited too because you picked an absolute banger to talk about for this show. But first, I wanted to ask for how are you? How is Montreal right now?
It's getting dark out, I'm feeling winter closing in on me, but things have been good otherwise,
I
not no
want
complaints.
good. I well, first of all, I live in America, so it's been a weird week, but
Mhm.
also I want some of the winter if you could send some down because I live in Texas and it is like 88 degrees today, Fahrenheit.
I'll
So
trade with you.
we are We are in mid-November and still dealing with like late summer weather, but otherwise we're doing okay. We're hanging in there. So, I want to talk to you a little bit about Coup de Grace because I just went back through maybe the final 50 pages of it last night. And it's a beautiful book. It's a devastating book. It is a frightening book. And I was listening to your chat with Neil on Talking Scared. Shout out to Talking Scared. Still the best horror lit podcast going. And you talked about how this began as various ideas centered around sort of making a love letter to the Montreal transit system and subway stations and things like that. And then
Mhm.
it expanded into this. Once you sort of made that determination that that was your setting for this book, and you got into the really heavy emotional weight of this book, how did that change your relationship to the Montreal transit system that you grew up on and have been on countless times?
Ooh. Um, I think it certainly gave it a new dimension. I feel like there's this exploratory, excited element to like riding the subway now, which feels it's such a mundane thing. I
Hmm.
have a driver's license, but I don't drive. Montreal is very much a like public transit friendly city. Um, you can have the bus or the metro to go like, wherever you might need to. Um, but it's given it an element of, I don't know, excitement to get to go and visit new stations. I'm suddenly seeing the beauty in the architecture of it, which I sort of took for granted before I started writing the project. So I don't know. That might be, I feel like that's a thing that happens to authors a lot where there is something either mundane or that you hadn't really considered. And then once you start writing about it, you get this sudden like enthusiasm and love for whatever it is that just passed you by in life. So from various projects, I have like a bizarre amount of knowledge and delight for really specific things, like a hydro dam, which appears in like one of the books that I'm writing, and
Hmm.
the Montreal subway system. So I don't know. It gives me a new lust for life.
Now, for the listeners who are jumping into this and don't know about the book, could you give us a little? I know I'm sure you're sick of doing this, but could you give a little teaser of what Coup de Grace is?
Oh, I love doing this. I was like joking with my partner where he was like every time he came to a book event, he was like, I'm gonna be like a mom at the back of like dance moms mouthing along with you the like plot synopsis to your book. So here it is. Coup de Grace is about a man who is done with life. He's decided that he's going to ride the subway transit system to the end of the line, get off at the terminus, and then just walk east into the Montreal St. Lawrence River and just drown. And before he's able to do that, when he disembarks, it's at a station that isn't the terminus. It is a station that doesn't exist. And so, as he's exploring it, trying to find an exit, he comes to find that there is no exit and that it's this enormous labyrinthian space that just seems to be growing. And so, it's both his experience with literally trying to explore that space and then metaphorically, when you're stuck in a space that's supposed to be temporary, um, what is that experience like? So, a lot of the aspects of the book deal with mental health and depression and suicidality. So, it's a very like internal book as much as the plot is about being stuck in a subway system.
It is a very good modern take on that sort of classic Shirley Jackson thing of the psychological conditions inside the characters are reflected in the external condition of the story. And it has that the wonderful modernity of exploring liminal spaces, which everyone on the internet is still obsessed with. I'm still subscribed to at least one liminal spaces bot on
Mhm.
social media. There's probably more. Um, but I have always sort of glanced off that kind of liminal space fiction, stuff like the backrooms and things like that. I find it
Mhm.
interesting, but I haven't necessarily found it scary until I read this book. And one of the reasons, it's not just that you have a wonderful grasp of Vickens' voice and character and emotional state. It's the way that the story truly unfolds with the psychological aura of a person who is, it really feels like if you were stuck in a place like this, how would you behave, what would you do, and what would you ultimately find? And it feels very organic the way Vicken explores these spaces. In writing it, did you try to think in advance about, okay, and now this room will be this, and this room will be this, and all of a sudden I'm going to make it 10 times bigger in this room? Did you map any of it out, or did you just sort of let Vicken make these discoveries?
It was a little bit of both. Initially, when I was writing it, I was using Scrivener a lot to write this. Um, I think that came from when it was originally a much larger project, and I was looking at a lot of different aspects of what a liminal space could be, um, experience-wise. I ended up narrowing it down to the experience of like depression and suicidality, but there were so many moving parts that I really had to like bracket them off, and I kept doing that when I was writing what ended up being like the finalized draft of Coup de Grace, where I wanted to look at what does depression do to the body and our experience to um, sex, our experience to food, our relationship to people around us, our relationship to nature. And so had sort of bracketed them off in that respect. Um, but then what that ended up looking like when Vicken was approaching various rooms ended up coming very naturally. I knew that I wanted a surreal space inside, um, that felt like it didn't belong there. So there is a sort of a lake room that appears in the book,
Hmm.
where you're like, oh, there shouldn't be a natural space in this like brutalist interior that's so utilitarian. All of a sudden, there's what seems like this like enormous interior lake, which is very much inspired by um, growing up my relationship to a lot of video games. I'm thinking of like uh, early N64 Legend of Zelda games where you would go to like these fishing spaces where it would be like a little
Hmm.
hut, and then you would like the screen would fade to black and then fade back open, and it'd be these enormous spaces. Um, so I love the idea of not being able to see the like schematics of an interior until you're like fully immersed inside of it. Um, but yeah, other than that, I just knew that there were certain beats that I wanted to hit. There is like an elevator scene where Vicken has that discovery. I knew that I wanted to go from like a very mundane, he's tired, he's been walking for a very long time, to this like sudden manic experience. And an elevator felt like a perfect sequence for the sort of like emotional up and downs. Um, so it's just about sort of like knowing what I want beat wise and then seeing what fit in. And I don't know, it just happened to like meld together really beautifully, um, in a way that like was felt more intuitive than like intentional.
Yes, it absolutely, that is the word. It feels very intuitive and very true to the character. And you mentioned the elevator, and that sort of leads me to the next thing I wanted to talk about is you pull from a lot of references come in because it's obviously you're exploring the mind of a single character as he is sort of unspooling all these different, like, well, this reminds me of this and this reminds me of this. And you, with the elevator, I don't want to spoil the book, but there is the internet famous elevator game is referenced in this book. The film Pulse, which is a wonderful Japanese horror film, is also mentioned. There are references to the Elisa Lam case for the true crime heads out there. Um, and obviously the liminality of it all, it calls to mind, House of Leaves and the back rooms and all of that stuff. Um, were you aware of those influences as you were writing, or were those just things that were in the back of your mind that sort of came through in Vicken's voice?
I think I was aware of them when I was writing it. I am a millennial, and I'd read a review maybe like a week ago where someone said that this was like a millennial scream into the void, and I was like, yes, this it is
Hmm.
very much that, because in the early 2000s there was the work that I was reading, and like the films that I was taking in had a very like postmodern voice, where there was a lot of like fourth wall breakage and a sort of like sardonic cynicism, which feels very like of the millennial generation. Um, and so I'm not sure if that was inherent, like if that was my voice or if I sort of grafted that onto Vicken. It's probably a little bit of both. But it did feel as though it feels like a very millennial, I'm like doing air quotes right now, response um, when you're faced with something that's so insurmountably inconceivable to go through almost these stages of grief where like one of them is like this cynical sense of humor because it's
Yeah.
just like you can't wrap your mind around what's happening and I feel like we're seeing a lot of that in people's response to what's happening around the world right now, just like politically and socially, economically. um so that felt like a very natural place to reach to with Vicken's voice. And I think that just comes from growing up with that noise sort of influencing my own voice.
It is interesting that you mentioned that because I'm also a millennial, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but there's a joke that comes up in many different forums on the internet that what's wrong with millennials? Why are they so anxious about everything? And it's like, well, we as millennials have lived through like six once in a generation crises at this point. And, I remember being, 15 years old when 9/11 happened and like watching it in my high school classroom. And then, that you had the Great Recession, and then you had, you know, all the way up to what just happened
Mm.
here in America a few weeks ago, or a few days ago, rather. And it really has that feeling that this guy who I love Vicken's voice. I love his sense of humor. As a recovering alcoholic myself, I've never dealt with suicidal ideation, but I do have that labyrinthian psychological thing. I remember that happening to me, so that really
Mhm.
clicked for me. But it also is just this wonderful story of a guy who cannot catch a break, and who is just trying and trying and trying to find some kind of some anything concrete to take away from this strange experience.
Mhm.
And without, again, listeners, we're getting into slightly spoilery territory. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I am going to talk about sort of the formalist changes that happen at the end of the book. So if you are
Mhm.
worried about that, maybe skip 5 minutes ahead. I love that, and it's a very millennial thing that at the end you make it. I mean, the easiest comparison is a choose your own adventure book, but an augmented reality game is also something that we love as the people of
Mhm.
our generation. And I loved being able to look at it from the perspective of Vic and essentially going, all right, you pick. I don't know anymore. I've been running down dead ends for God knows how long. You pick. Uh, was that always like in the conceptual stages of this, was that always something you wanted to do, or was it a sort of surprise conclusion for you?
um it came a little bit later in the game, at least when I was writing about liminal space. It was the first thing that happened when I started writing specifically about Vicken. I've like told this story before, but when I was writing the original manuscript, it felt so large and very philosophical. And so, in order to extrapolate those ideas into the length of a novella, it felt like I had to use this very like verbose language to be able to like encompass everything that I was trying to say. And I was getting really frustrated reading my own work. So I went to go lie down and I just opened up the notes on my phone and I started to write to myself from the perspective of one of the characters, which ended up being Vicken, um, out of like frustration for what he was being put through. Um, and this like very distinct voice ended up coming out. And I found that it was interesting, at least from like a writer's perspective. I was like, oh, this has my attention again. And then it had me thinking about like metatextual elements of what does it mean to make a choice? What does it mean to have agency over your own body? or lack of agency in terms of like the systems that are in place or the chemical things that are happening to your body, or the time that you were born or the body that you were born in. um, how do these things attribute a lack of control over your life? And then can that lack of control be like given to the hands of the readers, where it's like the reader is now the antagonist or the savior? um and that's also very much like influenced from my experience growing up like millennial, and very much as like a gamer, because I've always liked those aspects of like media. I've always loved immersive theater. I thought it was really interesting when Black Mirror did the like Bandersnatch episode where you can sort of decide what happens to the character, um, and seeing how that sort of railroading might happen in a novel. And it felt like it was the perfect opportunity because liminal space and the idea of choice, um, it all felt like it like culminated really perfectly in this narrative somehow. Um, yeah, I feel like I keep going back to like the millennial thing, but I think it's like so much on my mind right now, because of like so much of what's happening in politics where people are
Hmm.
talking about like, oh, Gen Z, and like why are people voting in a certain direction? And a lot of things come back to the millennial generation being the sort of generation that got like sort of fucked over,
Yes.
um, and still have somehow a sense of hope and a sense of wanting the best for everyone. Obviously, this is like I'm speaking in blanket terms for like entire generations, but that's sort of how it feels. And reflecting on Coup de Grace, it very much feels like it's this scream into the void, like that reviewer said, um, where it's like, okay, fuck it, I've tried to do everything right, and I'm still so miserable. You guys choose. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah.
so that's how it sort of ended up there from a long and winding way.
Well, you mentioned the lack of control and the feeling of a lack of agency and not knowing what to do, and I mentioned my own experience in recovery, and which a big part of recovery is saying like, all right, I don't know how to do this. I'm gonna have to get someone else to figure this out, which is scary and fascinating at the same time. And uh, I don't, you can speak as little or as much about this as you like. It's totally up to you. But I did want to ask, I know something of your journey, not just as a writer, but as a queer creator and a queer person in a world that is often hostile to queer people. Um, how did writing this book, if at all, change your outlook on the space that you're in and the spaces that you've gone through in your life to get where you are now?
Mm. It was very much I'm trying to like think of the word. It was like almost a euphoric experience where I
Mm,
was able to draw up all of these experiences that I've had, like the couple of years leading up to writing the story, and pieced them together into this narrative. Um, since then, a lot in my life has changed. I think it's just like the world has changed. My relationships to people have changed. I think during the pandemic, a lot of people sort of found themselves in a lot of ways because you
mm,
couldn't really seek externally validation as much anymore. Um, and so our relationships to our bodies changed, our relationships to the people that we know and our work changed. And so spending so much time alone and by myself and with these thoughts reframed a lot of what I had written. Um, but I think for the better, where initially when I was writing it, I had to very much balance delicately the tilt onto whether or not Vicken wanted to take his own life. Like it really has to feel as though it's riding the line
yeah.
right down the middle. Um, where it doesn't feel like, oh, but he's got like a great life, so it would make sense that he would live, or like, oh, his life is completely miserable. Like, why doesn't he just, take his own life. Um, and I felt very much one way when I was writing it, and now I'm trying to have a little bit more of like the hopeful side of things. Um, so I don't know if that was just like a practice of fake it till you make it sort of thing, or
Mm.
just growing up or learning more about myself through the work that I've written. But it gave me some perspective on that. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
It
what I'm
absolutely
thinking.
does. It's beautiful answer. Thank you for sharing that with us. But now I promise listeners, this is going to seem a little jarring, but I promise it's not, because this is a show about foundational horror stories, and I really try not to tip the scales in terms of influencing our guests. But when Sophia told me one of her candidates for this, I was like, please pick it, please. And we're both millennials. We're going to talk about I think, one of the great millennial horror films, in that it came out around the millennium, and also it's just that generation. House on Haunted Hill from 1999, the remake of the William Castle classic starring Vincent Price from 1959. Um, just off the top, I want to tell our listeners, if you have not seen this movie, it rules. It's so much fun. It is so fun that I was rewatching it last night. My wife stayed up later than she intended to watch parts of it with me, and my wife does not watch horror films. So, Sophia, because you picked it, I want to start by asking you what you remember about your first experience with this movie.
Oh my gosh. I must have been maybe like 12, which is actually maybe a little bit older than I would have like thought to have remembered. But I used to do these fright nights with all my friends. I went to an all girl school. It was like Miss Edgar's and Miss Cramp's School for Girls. It was like a very particular sort of lifestyle. And I was like the horror friend. I took a lot of pride in being able to like watch the scariest horror movies, and be unfazed, at least in the eyes of my friend, by myself later at night. I would like huddle like a little burrito in my bed sheets with fear and completely be unmoving the entire night. But this was one of the movies that we would watch, or like that we did watch during one of the fright nights that I did. And I just remember being in my parents' living room, with like our big, like the TV that has like these like big booty. It's like really like thick in the back.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
very like 90s TV screen. And like renting this from Blockbuster, and um my friends and I being so scared after watching this movie that like none of us wanted to run across the room to like hit pause on the VHS player, um, to stop it. So it ended up going through the entire credits, and then we ended up finding out that there's an after credit scene, um, where Geoffrey Rush is like being tortured for all of eternity by the like ex patients of the asylum that this movie
Hmm.
takes place in. Um, but I just remember it absolutely terrifying me. There's like so many elements that we can like talk about in this film, but the CGI element of like this thing that they call the darkness in the movie, um, which is just this very like uncanny valley looking CGI creature of like all the souls and evil and like things that have happened in this old asylum amalgamated into one thing. Um, and when ended up rewatching it over the weekend with my partner, and he was saying like, "Oh, this reminds me so much of the bear from Annihilation, where it's like it's using a
Mm.
voice that's not its own. It's like stealing voices and pieces from people that it's absorbed." Uh, and so the darkness does this as well in this movie. And there's something about that like moment in time where the CGI was like not good, but not bad enough to like be laughable. It's just uncanny valley enough that it feels like a weird like LSD acid trip nightmare. Um, I also love the idea of like a game show sort of battle royale thing where it's like that's a great use of like a millionaire's money. Just like invite a bunch of rich people over to a haunted asylum and have them like stay there and try and stay alive until morning. I love that. It feels
Yes.
very like Shirley Jackson, Haunting of Hill
Yes.
House, where there's like I don't know, the game showification of something. is something that has like largely influenced a lot of my work and like the types of work that I'm drawn to. Um, and then the last like big thing that I'll say is like the location itself, like a space having a mind of its own. Uh, there's like a scene in this movie where the asylum like locks itself down. There's literally like these giant gears that turn and bring down these steel shutters over all of the doors and windows. And I absolutely love that. I love like hostile architecture. I was gonna like ask what your like first experience with this movie was because you said that you
I
rewatched it recently. So
yeah, I I've talked about this on the show before, but when I was a kid, I was not allowed anywhere near horror movies, which is I'm fascinated. I very much tell myself I have a son now, and I'm very much like I'm not going to influence him to be anything he doesn't want to be. He gets to choose what he's into, what he wants to be, the direction his life takes. That's all him, but I'm like I want a kid to come up to me and say, "Daddy, please pick out horror movies for me and my friends to watch," because I never did
please.
that in my age when I was that young. But I think my first experience with this movie was I went through a phase. Speaking of my recovery, which we're talking about a lot on this episode, y'all. Um, I went through a phase where I lived alone and I was newly sober, and I was just sort of it is a cliche, and you hear this from a lot of horror fans are in recovery, and they talk about horror is like my new addiction. Like I pass some of those tendencies onto horror. And I kind of did that like in the first months of recovery where I had all the streaming services pulled up and I was just going through like what have I never seen? What should I go back and try? And I found House on Haunted Hill and watched it and just was like, this is so fun. This is so beautifully designed and everyone in the movie understands the assignment. And I think what did it for me in terms of luring me in was the Geoffrey Rush. For those who don't know, Geoffrey Rush plays an amusement park guy. He's a rich man who runs amusement parks and he specializes in thrill rides and things that are going to scare people. And he's a Jeffrey Rush plays him as a total sleazebag with the thinnest mustache you have ever seen. It's so thin it could cut the fabric of reality. And yes, his wife, who he hates, he and his wife hate each other. Famke Janssen plays his wife, and she says, I want to have my birthday party at this haunted insane asylum that has been restored that's up on this hill in Los Angeles. And he says, okay, fine. And invites people over and tells them, hey, if you survive the night, you get $1 million. Free and clear. Here's a check to cash for $1 million. All you have to do, survive this night. And what they don't know is there are ghosts in this building. Like it's actually haunted, which is a departure from the original film. The original film is the plot of the husband and wife sort of trying to kill each other and frame each other and do all this other stuff, and the ghosts are all fake. In the movie, the ghosts are real. And I think from the moment that I'll tell you the shot that got me, and I saw it again last night, and I got so excited, and my wife was like, "What are you excited about?" It's the moment when they're in like the main entryway to the house and they open that coffin, and inside the coffin is a bunch of dry ice and a bunch of little coffins, and all the little coffins have a gun inside because that's part of the party. I was like, this is my kind of movie. This is absolutely, and it's great because it doesn't sacrifice, it's clearly having a lot of fun with its own concept, but it does
Mhm.
not sacrifice scares. There are moments in this movie that are genuinely frightening. And I love a movie that is so committed to what it's going to be and
Mhm.
kind of revels in it. Like, yeah, some of the lines, some of the bits of dialogue, I'm like, that's not how people talk.
Questionable.
But you know, I'll take it because I'm having so much fun. So
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you because you mentioned hostile architecture, and I didn't expect to connect this to Coup de Grace in such a clear way, but I'm watching these people wander through this labyrinth of because there's a whole sequence where they have to go down to the basement because they're like Sophia said the building locks down on its own and they're trying to find the controls that will unlock it, and they go down to the basement and it just seems like this endless labyrinth of rooms and doors and cobwebs and lights that won't stop flickering. And I was like, oh, no wonder Sophia picked this. This is absolutely way more and the architecture of the building itself is a little more art deco than brutalist, but when you
Hmm.
get down in those basements there are staircases that seem to be 100 feet tall and all this other fun stuff down there. um do you think that's where it, did you already love weird architecture before you saw this movie, or just is this kind of the patient zero moment for that for you?
I definitely loved it. I think before this movie, I'm thinking as well of like Rose Red, the Stephen King
Oh
like
yeah.
mini series, quote unquote, which is just like a very large house that also has a mind of its own. I did love this one because it's an asylum. It's not a haunted house necessarily. Um, and so the largeness of the space and that it used to be such a utilitarian structure adds another element that like a mansion wouldn't necessarily have. And I love, like you said, the Art Deco architecture. There's something about the like future past aesthetic design that like feels very Chrysler building.
Yeah.
Um, I know I keep like mentioning games on this episode, but it feels very
No, go
Bioshock.
for it. Go for it.
Um,
Bioshock,
I,
yes,
I
it does feel very Bioshock. Yeah.
yeah, and I love that idea. I love what they did with the set design. The like it feels very grungy, it feels very lived in. You have like lime wash walls. There's like a stained glass ceiling in the main room. It has this like beautiful black and white tiling everywhere and this element to it that almost reminded me of the mummy in that it's like tomb like because there's rooms that almost feel booby trapped. And so you don't necessarily know what the characters are getting into when they're exploring a new space. It's not like, okay, we're going up to the attic. It's going to look like an attic now. Like we don't know what's in the basement. Um, there ends up being the like zoetrope hyperbolic saturation chamber that they
Oh,
characters
that
lock
thing.
Jeffrey Rush into. And like, oh my God, that scared the piss out of me when I was a kid. Like that scene specifically was such nightmare fuel, this like weird choppy style animation. Um, and it's like I had no idea until I rewatched it this weekend that it's Jeffrey Combs as the like 1930s mad surgeon.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and oh my God, that just added a whole other element of delight when I was watching it. Um, but yeah, this like freaky animation chamber absolutely totally terrified me. I don't like the idea of like being stuck somewhere, which is like very apparent in Coup de Class. But it happens to these characters in this movie in like different ways.
Yeah, it's that chamber. I had completely forgotten about that scene and went back and watched it and forgot that, it's I forget what they call it in the movie, like an immersion chamber or something. But yeah,
Yeah.
it is like a phantasmagoria where they turn it on and it starts spinning these images around him until they look like they're animated. But then it goes further and gives you like this black and white fever dream with these like grotesque faces and people talking about how he's unwell and he needs to be cured, and it has that wonderful thing of horror films of this era. They love to play with frame rates. So like you said, all
Mm-hmm.
the monsters like twitch and thrash in a way that makes them exist sort of out of the same speed of reality. That was very common in this era, and I'm still such a sucker for it.
Very
And
Jacob's Ladder.
yes, very Jacob's Ladder, and I think it even, the same people. But this, by the way, was the first film to come out of Dark Castle Entertainment, which, for those who don't know, uh, takes its name from William Castle, who was a legendary horror B movie writer producer, made the original House on Haunted Hill, 13 Ghosts. The Tingler, which also stars Vincent Price, which is super underrated. If you haven't seen The Tingler, that is a great like meta horror movie. Um, and Dark Castle was like, yeah, we're gonna remake all these William Castle things, and they did House of Wax and other stuff came later. And it has that feeling, like you said, it's future past. It's very like we're gonna do plenty of nods to these movies that came out in the 50s that have that sort of stylish 50s movie thing, and we're gonna give Geoffrey Rush a pencil mustache and like a cravat and cigars and all this other stuff. But we're also gonna bring in these hip. We're gonna put Taye Diggs in the movie, ladies. We're gonna put Ali Larter in the movie, gents. We're gonna put pop star Lisa Loeb in for one scene, because why not? That was also very funny when we were watching it last night. My wife went, "Is that Lisa Loeb?" But yeah, yeah, pop star Lisa Loeb. She got to be in this horror movie for a second. It's it's such a great merging of sensibilities. And one thing I was sort of surprised by when you picked it, because it's not that listeners, I want to be clear, Coup de Grace is fun to read. It is a fun book, but it does not have that same sort of over the top tone. It's much more sort of internalized. Whereas the Dark Castle movies are famous for being like almost operatic in the way that they throw stuff around. So, what about the sort of vibe of the movie beyond the design of it has stuck with you for so long?
I do love the mix of like camp and like fun novelty. Um, I am very like on principle anti-fun about a lot of things. Like I love to be a hater when people love fun things. This was like especially true of like when I was a kid. If something got really popular, like the OC, I was like, I'm not gonna watch this on principle because everyone loves it.
Oh my
You know,
God, I did that too with the exact same show. Yes.
as I've gotten older, I've learned to like be a little more moderate in my approach to like sometimes things that are popular because they're good. And yeah, I think if you approach this movie as like it is a B movie, it is like sort of schlocky and campy, um, and like of the time, it very much feels like a late 90s, early 2000s movie. Um, that it is a lot more fun. Like it feels like there's less restraint around it. I loved also I had read somewhere that the main character, or I guess like Geoffrey Rush's character, um, does very much feel like an homage to William Castle in that
Yes.
he's like in charge of this theme park that centers so much around like thrills and sort of fake outs. And then a lot of what happens at the start of House on Haunted Hill feels like it's centered around these sort of thrills and fake outs where it's like, oh, it's just like him and his wife and they fucking hate each other and they're trying to scare each other to death, basically. And you don't think that there's an actual threat until there is a supernatural threat. And I had been reading about William Castle and when he was initially putting these movies like in theater, that he would always have a sort of like immersion element to them where
Yeah.
he would have like 3D glasses for people to wear to like see certain elements in the movie that wouldn't otherwise appear, or he had like, I think it was the original House on Haunted Hill, he had like rigged a spooky skeleton to like fly across
Yes. Yes.
the theater like during the film. And I'm like, oh my God, first of all, what a legend. And second of all, I love that sort of like full immersion, which it's hard. You don't like see that done very much anymore. I think because like there's so much saturation in the different styles of like what can be done to break the fourth wall nowadays. The like some of the last times I think that was done effectively was like Blair Witch Project when they were doing the like viral sort of campaign for that and made it feel
Yeah.
real. Or like Ghost Watch, I'm thinking, did it like so effectively because it came
Yeah.
from like such an unexpected space, um, of this like legacy media. And I don't know, I always loved that element of it. So that sort of appears in a way in Good Class. Although I don't know, it was like entirely intentional or like related to this film, but like now that I'm drawing the threads together, it makes sense.
We can make your book more immersive. We need subway ticket bookmarks with Felix's number on the back. We all need those. That would
I
be
literally
amazing.
made some. I
Oh
literally
yeah?
made some. Oh my God, wait. But there is like a little subway ticket that I made, and it's like modeled after the Montreal subway tickets from like the 90s.
Oh, that's so
Um,
cool.
but the prices have been updated. Now it is 375 because inflation. But yes, I'm holding up like actual little subway tickets that I made
That's
that are little
amazing.
bookmarks.
Yes, yes, those are so cool. Um, but yeah, William Castle, with House on Haunted Hill, he called it Emergo. But
Ooh.
it was basically just a skeleton on a zip line that would come across the top of come over the house as there are scenes in that original film involving a skeleton heavily, listeners, and
Mhm.
he would zip the skeleton down from the back of the theater to the front during those scenes. There are photographs of it happening, and it looks like the most fun anyone's ever had in a movie theater. And I really wish my one of my like horror collector holy grails is for 13 Ghosts, he made the little 3D glasses, and the idea was if you're scared and you don't want to see the ghosts, you don't have to put on the glasses. But if you want to see the ghosts, put on the glasses and you'll see the ghosts. And the ghosts in that movie are really well designed. And I can imagine what it was like being a kid and like throwing those glasses on. So I would love to one day own a pair of the original 13 Ghost glasses. But anyway, yeah, this movie has that sort of Carnival Barker feel to it in some ways that is very much a nod to Castle and what he did. But the Dark Castle upgrade, obviously, is the ghosts. And they could have done that in a very like pedestrian by the book way, but they went, as we've already mentioned, this really interesting way and made it like, yeah, there are ghosts and you can see the ghosts, but also there is this thing, and yeah, the guy who owns the house, whose father and grandfather died because of the house, calls it the darkness, um, which feels like a sort of being that's made of collective trauma and vengeance. And it reminded me of your sort of wall of bodies that occurs in the book, that there's a moment where it's just a wall that is a collection of writhing human masses, and it looks like, oh, these are all the people who were sort of claimed by this place, maybe.
Mhm.
Um, is that a connection worth making? Is that do you think that that lived in your imagination for that long and then made its way forward, or did you have some other source of inspiration for that?
I definitely think that as like an image was dramatic enough that it sort of like locked itself into my mind. Um, it's something that I've written about more than once. There was my first ever published short story is called The Arbor Glyph. And it's about two friends that get into a car accident. One of them dies. The other one brings him to like a sort of a mad scientist. And his friend is revived. But over the course of a week, he starts to get like reclaimed by nature and reabsorbed into the world, into like cosmic soup. Um, and that notion has always really both comforted and frightened me. It's nice to imagine that after your consciousness is gone, that you become part of this like great cosmic energy. And then it's also really horrifying because it's like, what if it doesn't, what if it happens in like piecemeal increments? What if, you're torn apart in these like different little small ways, and your consciousness remains, and you're trapped in this sort of infinite timeless space forever. Um, and so I think that appears in like several of the things that I write because it's had such a strong impact on me. I don't know if that comes like specifically from the darkness, but the image of it and like the concept of that specifically from this movie was like so striking to me that even before I rewatched it, it was one of the things that like had stuck out in my memory, that weird like CGI. It almost looks like a Rorschach test, like
Yeah,
figure that appears. It's like both 2D and 3D, and it's like shifting in this sort of oily aesthetic. And all these different like faces start to appear in it, appealing to whoever it's talking to, which is really spooky to me.
Yeah, and it transcends that at a certain point, and we've talked about hostile architecture, and yet this movie ends with like literal hostile architecture to the point that the house forms a mouth at the end of a hallway
Oh,
and sort of starts to come after them, which I always love. I love ghost stories of all kinds. But I really have a soft spot for like, no, it's not just a ghost or six ghosts or whatever. It's the house, it's the place. There is something wrong with it. Um, and that has stuck with me for so long. And I love how much they play with it in the book. The book, sorry, the movie. Gosh, I'm conflating questions and answers in my head right now.
no worries. I was just gonna say, like, what you just said, I had like literally written down in my like quick notes for this episode where it's like it's not the haunting isn't necessarily focused on the patients. It's more of like the space itself has absorbed whatever has happened there, which feels like a different kind of scare than an individual haunting. Um, and it feels more hostile, and the facelessness of it feels like it hits fear in a different way. Um, and almost like the space knows itself more and can use itself against you more because it just is that space. Like the different rooms that the characters go into, um, this like the darkness or like the space itself, the architecture works against them depending on what room they're in, which I've always found really interesting. Instead of like it is a ghost that is haunting the space because it died there, which is like spooky and interesting in like different settings. But I think it works really much like I think it works really well in the favor of this movie, that it decided not to go with that route.
Yes, this is exactly what I was getting at. I don't know why I couldn't form it into a question, but thank you. Uh, and I also love that the house itself becomes a trickster. It takes on, it's not just that it's hostile and dangerous. It takes on this very trickstery persona to the point that one of the first things they find that's like, hey, this is weird and bad is there's literally a vat of blood in the basement, just
Yeah,
a vat of human blood, and the movie moves so quickly that they kind of never talk about it, but it's there's
I
a
never
whole
question
scene with
it.
there's a whole scene with a vat of blood, and then Ali Larter's character comes back in the room and says, I almost drowned in a tub of blood, and everyone's like, oh, well, that's weird. Anyway, is there more vodka? We probably should get drunker while we're experiencing this whole thing. um I love that moment. I think my favorite moment in the movie is when Bridget Wilson's character, Melissa, who is trying to capture, this is another very turn of the millennium thing. She has a camcorder with her and she's trying to capture something that she can sell to a TV station because she's a celebrity who's lost her gig and she's trying to get something going. And so she's in the basement with the camcorder and she turns the camera on an operating table and she sees figures around the operating table doing their work and then lowers it, doesn't see them, raises it, sees them, and then they all turn and look at her. And that's such a wonderful, simple concept. And it feels to me a little bit like a nod to 13 Ghosts, the idea that there's a device that you can see the ghost with. Um, but I love that moment so much, and the payoff is great. It's also very funny that they get her camcorder back and they're like, maybe there are clues on this camcorder that can tell us what happened to her, but they don't rewind it that far.
Yeah.
They never rewind it enough to see did she catch a ghost on camera or not, and we never know, which is kind of frustrating. But what is your favorite like set piece moment scare from the movie? Is it still the immersion chamber? Is it something else?
I think it's the same one as you, like her going into that room and then only being able to see the surgeons operating on the camera. And then they all like very slowly look at her, which is just a very eerie image to begin with. And then this goes back to like the sort of space itself as hostile. Um, when they discover that she's missing and then they find her camcorder in that room just with like a puddle of blood, and then they're following the like streak of blood and it goes up into the wall and then ends at a corner, which I always found really disturbing as a kid because I'm like, oh, did the house sort of like digest her and like eat her? One of the things that's always really scared me, this is going to feel like a little bit of a tangent, but like bear with me here. Um, One of the things that really scares me is like submechanophobia. I don't like metal and machinery in water. It really freaks me out. And one of the things that people always talk about with submechanophobia is something called delta P, which is just when um, two different atmospheres are like readjusting. So if you have like two vats of water and then a tube between them, and one vat is full and one vat is empty, if you open the tube between them, the water will equalize itself.
Yeah.
And what'll happen in that tube is it'll like create this intense suction force. Um, and just being sort of like slurped out of your skin really freaks me out. And it feels like that's what the house sort of did to her. Like, I can't imagine how her organs would have been sort of crunched into the corner of a wall. Um, this is all the things that were running through my little like 12-year-old mind when watching that scene. But it just had such an effect on me because it's so affecting visually. And I think that they did it really, really well, even though it seems so simple on its surface.
Yeah, there are a lot of great little moments like that that are peppered through, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about the humor in this because it is extremely funny. Like they are all getting drunk and trying to figure out what their next step would be. There's a wonderful moment at the end, which spoiler alert for a 25-year-old movie. Uh, this the bit is that they've all been called to the house because they are the descendants of the only people who survived the insane asylum fire that made the place haunted, right? And so the ghosts want them because it's a form of vengeance. They're claiming those bloodlines. And there's this great bit where the darkness is coming for all of them, and Taye Diggs looks at it and says, "I'm not even a part of this. I was adopted." the, at the most intense moment of the movie, like two people have died in the last 30 seconds, and he yells, "I was adopted." Um, I love. We talked about it already, like the idea of these tonal, and I think it's so important to me because we do spend so much time now talking about quote unquote elevated horror, and we draw these distinctions between, oh, that's like an A24 movie, so it's completely serious, but this other movie is like just like a fun, like Megan is so fun, it's just fun horror, and I'm like, you can do both. You can do, I mean, even to the like Vic I don't think there are outright like jokes in your book, but Vicken is funny. Vicken is an extremely funny guy who's just navigating an impossible situation with that sardonic wit that makes the book crackle so wonderfully. And I always like talking about movies like this with guests because it reminds me of I was just talking to Josh Mallerman, and he was talking about the variety of horror, all the things that horror can hold. And this movie is very like, look, we're going to talk all about how the collective trauma of this building has made not only the building sentient, but has created this life form that is entirely composed of human souls and behaves in a weird way. And isn't that terrifying? But also, we're gonna do the "I was adopted" joke, and I love
Yeah.
that.
Also, the building can somehow hack into someone's email and rewrite a
That's
guest list. I'm like, it makes no sense. It's delightful.
that is the most hand wavy thing they do in the whole movie, where they're like, "Well, wait, if the house is haunted, then how did we get invited?" And the guy just goes, "Ghosts are energy, right? So it makes sense that they could manipulate the energy in a computer." And I'm like, "Yeah, but like the computer was on the other side of town. How'd they?
They're like
Why didn't?"
loudly anyway.
If the ghost could do that, why couldn't they just find you all at your individual houses? Don't worry. But anyways, they're more Scotch. So as we kind of start to wrap up here, um, I like asking how these stories live on in the imaginations of the people who found them so impactful. And you've talked about childhood memories of watching this movie and being so scared that you literally couldn't cross a living room to turn a TV off. Um, Now that you've revisited it and talked it through, what do you see about this film that is still percolating in your imagination?
I think there's a couple different things, a lot of which we like touched on over the course of our conversation, but the um there being two types of threat, I think, is always a really interesting way to approach a horror story where there's two different perceived threats, like a serial killer and a supernatural thing, and then you think it's one and then you think it's the other and it ends up being both. I think that's a funny little, like a fun little twist. um I love obviously the like anomalous architecture. Also having rewatched this, I love a large part of it because I think that the set design is beautiful. I think that it makes me think a lot. Um, and part of that thinking is almost like hate fueled. And by that, I mean, uh, parts of it were not good. And it had me thinking about like what would have made it better. And I think that that's the source of a lot of art that we make sometimes, where it's like, oh, had we extrapolated the relationship between Stephen Price and his wife Evelyn, where they have this like love hate, almost like BDSM relationship with each other. What if you wrote a story that was like focused more on that? Or what if you wrote a story about this like gorgeous Art Deco architecture asylum that burnt down in the 1930s? What if you wrote a story about like what happened there in the 1930s? Because you get like a glimpse of it at the start of the film where they have like a flashback scene to show the fire and the lockdown. Um, but sometimes it like it's just a tease, you want a little bit more. And so when I was watching this, I there were so many little elements where I was like, okay, it makes sense first of all that I would like it made sense to me that I would pick this movie for us to talk about. um because there were so many different elements of it that I fell in love with, and then it just made me want to see how you could mix and match these elements in different ways. So that was like largely my takeaway in revisiting it. um, I love it. I also hate parts of it, and then that makes me want to think about it more.
That is such an underrated part of, and this is something that I love about horror fans in general, is we will watch the masterpieces, absolutely, but we will also watch the movie that we saw from the video store in 1995 that is garbage, but we'll sit there and go, yeah, but it's got that one really good kill though. And it was a good idea, but it didn't quite go the way. And I do this with horror movies, but I also do it with Christmas movies because I'm a weird Christmas nut. That's a whole different podcast, though. Um, our guest has been Sofia Ajram. Sophia, before we let you go, could you let everyone know what you've got coming up and where they can find you online?
Right now, I've got longer works in the pipeline, so I can't really talk about them yet. But I'm online at Sofia Ajram on all of the platforms. um, but yeah, that's
All right.
it was a delight talking to you.
It was a delight talking to you. And whenever those other works do make it out into the world, we would love to have you back on. Thanks for being on the show.
So much.
Thanks once again to Sofia Ajram for being on the show. Coup de Grace is everywhere books are sold right now. It is one of the best horror debuts of the year. It's one of the best horror debuts of the last 5 years, at least. It's an incredible novella. You can read it in an evening. You're going to have a great time. You're going to feel the darkness a little bit. But honestly, if you love horror storytelling, if you love the way that certain writers are gifted at sort of probing the darkness and pushing back against it and exploring every curve and every wrinkle in that darkness, Sophia is your person. He is a remarkable storyteller, and I can't wait to read whatever the next Sophia Ajram thing is going to be because I'm sure she's cooking up something wonderful. In the meantime, if you want to keep up with everything we're doing, you can go to find us on social media. We are at Scares Shaped Us on Blue Sky. We are at Scares Shaped Us on Twitter. We are the Scares That Shaped Us on Facebook. We are the Scares That Shaped Us on YouTube. We also have a website, thescaresthatshapedus.com. That's where you can find an archive of every show that we've done so far and information on how to contact us. Our email is on there. If you want to email us, we're at scaresthatshapeduspodcast@gmail.com. If you have questions, suggestions, things you'd like to hear us talk about on the show, authors you'd like us to pursue, anything you want to talk to me about, I'm here, ready to read your emails. That's it for us this week. We will be back in 2 weeks with the always wonderful Clay McLeod Chapman to talk about the holiday classic Black Christmas. So don't miss that. That will drop December 18th at noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern. Until next time, I'm Matthew Jackson, and this is The Scares That Shaped Us.